Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to the program today. I'm glad y'all could make it. Before we get started, I want to thank this month's sponsor, Lou King, for sponsoring the program today. And I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. John Smith. He is a professor at Texas A&M University over in Commerce. And today he's going to be talking about the American Revolutionary War and the Millennialism movement. Try to say that 5 times fast. And I'm sure he will explain what all of that really means. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you, and good noon to you. It's high noon, isn't it? So, or nearabouts. So, yeah, try spelling apocalypticism over and over again. That one is just as much fun. So, all right. On May 19th, 1780, the morning skies over New England suddenly, ominously darkened. According to one witness, in most parts of the country, let me show you this. Whoops, wrong way. In most parts of the country, the darkness was so great in the daytime that the people could not tell the hour by either watch or clock, nor dine nor manage their domestic business without the light of candles. The sun eventually re-emerged in the late afternoon, but once it had set, the night seemed exceedingly dark, as if every luminous body in the universe had been shrouded in impenetrable shades or struck out of existence, according to another observer. This was followed by the appearance of an almost full moon colored a disquietingly dark shade of red, like blood. The war for American independence had not been going well for the colonies, despite the French alliance signed 2 years before, and this quote-unquote dark day seemed a premonition of defeat. However, rather than see in the dark day a foreshadowing of American doom, Patriot ministers' sermons on the event saw the herald of a turning point, a sign that God would soon deliver to the Americans the righteous victory for which they had been praying. The revolutionary clergy reminded their audiences that God often communicates through signs and wonders. Ezra Stiles reflected that it is not recollected from history that a darkness of equal intenseness and duration has ever happened in any parts of the world except in Egypt and at the miraculous eclipse at the crucifixion of our blessed Savior. The inky blackness of the day turned out to have been caused by slash and burn timber operations along the main frontier, but it still frightened many people, or many thousands of people in fact, and was spoken of for years afterward in tones of awe and wonder. Popular perceptions of the violent detachment from Great Britain and the creation of a new republic filled Americans with apocalyptic anxiety and millenarian expectation. For some, the rapidly unfolding drama heralded the dawn of a new nation preordained by God and populated by His chosen people. For others, the recent wars and accompanying social upheaval confirmed the depraved nature of humanity, and when compared to contemporaneous supernatural occurrences, displayed terrifying signs of the tribulation foretold in the books of Daniel and Revelation. The American Revolution was seen by many of those who experienced it through the lenses of Christian belief and prophecy interpretation, while clever revolutionaries used millenarian language to generate support for the revolution. Prophecy belief throbs at the heart of religious experiences of the revolution. In the mid-1760s, new legislation from Parliament after the 7 Years' War raised concerns about the motives of members of Parliament voting for a series of acts designed to increase revenue from the colonies in various ways. Colonial newspapers reprinted sections of Cato's letters, in one of which readers were warned that corrupt ministers dared not attack openly and barefaced the liberties of the free people, but in their quest, quote, to make the people poor and themselves rich, end quote, will engage all manner of wicked and dangerous projects. They will squander away the public money in wanton presents to minions, or in pensions to mercenary and worthless men and women for vile ends and traitorous purposes. The next sentence must have jarred readers and listeners. They will engage their country in ridiculous, expensive, fanatical wars to keep the minds of men in continual hurry and agitation, and under constant fears and alarms, and by such means deprive them both of leisure and inclination to look into public miscarriages. The Stamp Act of 1765 was more, or is seen as more, than a heinous mark of British absolutism. It was likened to the biblical mark of the beast foretold in the book of Revelation. Apocalyptic interpretations of the hated act flooded American newspapers and broadsides, the best example perhaps being Paul Revere's engraving that features a dragon-like beast tearing a copy of the Magna Carta and crushing a hapless victim underfoot while valiant colonists struggle to fight the monster in a manner reminiscent of St. George himself. John Adams, in a series of articles printed in the Boston Gazette in August 1765, titled A Dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law, employed millenarian themes to argue against the legitimacy of parliamentary supremacy over the colonial legislatures. Painting the rule of kings and aristocrats as a tool of the Antichrist, he depicted the American colonies as a bulwark against the tyrannical and anti-Christian blending of civil and ecclesiastical power arising in Britain. In a significant footnote, Adams opined that the colonization of America was... Oh, there it is. Are we good? Okay. Anyway, the colonization of America was the opening of a grand scene and design in Providence for the elimination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth. The Stamp Act proved impossible to implement, much less enforce, and so when news of its repeal reached the colonies in the late spring and early summer of 1766, ministers took to their pulpits to give thanks to God for yet another deliverance of his chosen people, extolling the benevolence of King George III and the belated wisdom of Parliament. The rejoicing did not last. Further measures by Parliament to tax and regulate the provincial economies heightened antagonism between Britain and its colonies. The greatest concern to clerics came as a result of the passage of the Quebec Act in 1774, which, among its provisions for officially establishing the Church of England in Canada, guaranteed religious toleration and political enfranchisement to the majority Catholic population. It also, as you can see, it also extended the southern border all the way to the Ohio River, cutting off potential access to that area to British Americans. To those most alarmed by it, the Quebec Act could only mean that satanic Roman Catholicism had infiltrated the court of St. James. Daniel Barber, a 19-year-old private in the Continental Army writing at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, recalled the popular perception among his fellow recruits that George III, by granting the Quebec Bill, had thereby become a traitor, had broken his coronation oath, was secretly a papist, and whose design was to oblige this country to be given up and destroyed, soul and body, by that frightful image with 7 heads and 10 horns. Paul Revere, again, utilized vivid imagery in a famous engraving called the Mitred Minuet, in which 4 Anglican bishops stand with hands linked in the form of a cross over a copy of the Quebec Bill, while other bishops look on approvingly. Directing the dance are Lord North and King George himself, while a kilted Lord Bute provides music on the bagpipes, all of them taking their orders from Satan, hovering rather indiscreetly there behind them. Samuel Langdon, in a sermon on the 13th chapter of the book of Revelation, formulaically identified Roman Catholicism as the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, seen rising out of the ocean by John of Patmos. John of Patmos might have been thinking about the Roman Empire under the Flavian emperors, but Langdon saw the beast as the recovered Holy Roman Empire, with its mixture of civil and ecclesiastical power vested in the papal Antichrist. The second beast, which John saw arising out of the earth, Langdon distinguished as the papacy embodied in the Pope himself, who cast himself as a King of Kings in mockery of Christ, thus betraying his identity as the Antichrist. Although anti-Catholicism was most virulent in New England, it was a widespread sentiment in the colonies. In the South Carolina backcountry, for example, Anglican parson Charles Woodmason fumed about a broadside posted by evangelical Presbyterians accusing him and his fellow Church of England clergy of being, quote, Romish priests in disguise, intending to bring in popery and slavery to the province, end quote. It must be emphasized that fear and hatred of Roman Catholicism stemmed from popular belief that the Catholic Church was aligned with Satan and would serve the Antichrist in the tumult of the latter day. Considering the excesses of anti-British violence against known and suspected supporters of the Crown and Parliament, even those who defended colonial grievances worried that they may lose the moral high ground to loyalism. The decision to create an intercolonial defense force was foisted upon the colonies after the British regulars engaged Massachusetts militia first at Lexington and Concord and then at Bunker Hill in 1775. The Second Continental Congress heatedly debated the formation of the Continental Army during the ensuing weeks, the delegations from Pennsylvania, New York, and the Lower South uncertain about the necessity of bloodshed to restore their constitutional rights. Previously believed to be their ultimate champion, King George III was transformed in a matter of months from a benevolent but poorly advised defender of the colonies to a sinister tyrant in league with the Antichrist. The war for independence would not only be a just war, but a holy one. Religion provided a construct around which Americans interpreted events following the battles of Lexington and Concord, just as they had during the 7 Years' War. Ministers from most of the dissenting denominations roared their support for the revolution and the war effort from their pulpits, in the streets, and under oaks, imploring male listeners to enlist in a fight against evil itself. Some volunteered to serve as chaplains in the Continental Army and state militias. Presses cranked out dozens of sermons, pamphlets, and broadsides declaring that the ensuing conflict opened yet another chapter in the eternal war between heaven and hell. However, the violent separation of the American colonies from Great Britain did not fill every Christian soul with an unallied hope for the future. The initial military campaigns of 75 and 76 gave Americans little cause to celebrate or expect ultimate victory. Indeed, a string of defeats and humiliations following the American seizure of Boston cast doubts on the likelihood of God's favor upon the American cause. Millenarian patriots did not fear ultimate defeat and interpreted these early setbacks as mere chastisements for lingering sloth and venality. They encouraged Americans to reform themselves and rally to the cause in anticipation of the great victory of righteousness and liberty over apostasy and tyranny. Fast days were announced and special services conducted to pray for divine help, soothing patriot anxieties that their cause was just, that God defended the right, and that they would prevail. Reverend Amy R. Robbins is representative of the majority of clergymen who volunteered to serve as chaplains to the American forces in the first years of the war, offering spiritual support to the soldiers fighting for God and the Republic. Although General Washington considered them to be most valuable as enforcers of morals rather than morale, much less of piety, Robbins and his colleagues understood that soldiers who know that they fight with God on their side fight with greater valor and confidence, that even in death, an assured place in paradise awaits the fallen. Dispatched in 1775 to Benedict Arnold's army during the ill-fated invasion of Canada, Robbins often spoke of Judgment Day and the import of a Protestant army fighting to liberate Quebec, quote, which has been for ages the dwelling of Satan and reign of Antichrist, end quote. As they made their way northward, arriving at Lake George a few days after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Robbins chose that Sunday, July 7th, to preach on the verse from Revelation 14:7, quote, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgments is come, end quote. While the army rode down the St. Lawrence River, he noted in his journal that the soldiers in his boat, doubtless anxious in preparation for battle, questioned him intently about the book of Revelation and the prophecies of Daniel. Samuel Sherwood of New York was among the most prolific interpreters of the Revolution as an apocalyptic and millenarian event. In his 1776 sermon, The Church's Flight into the Wilderness, he identified America as the new Canaan and predicted that the prophecies in Revelation would reach their fulfillment in the United States of America. It was this new nation's destiny to be the wellspring of the destruction of Catholicism and Caesaropapacy. Taking chapter 17 of the Revelation as his text, Sherwood linked verse 16 to the Continental Congress's diplomatic overtures to France for economic and military aid. These 10 horns doubtless mean some of the kingdoms and princes of the earth that, having for a long time been under the influence of the beast, the great whore of Babylon, and had a great share with her in the cruel and bloody work of tyranny, persecution, and oppression. But the time is coming, and perhaps near at hand, when their league and friendship with her will be dissolved and broken, and their love turned into hatred and a spirit of revenge. The battles of the Revolutionary War were but the first skirmishes in the Battle of Armageddon, and soldiers in the Continental Army can assure themselves with the certainty that great numbers of angels are encamping round our coast for our defense and protection. Michael stands ready with all the artillery of heaven to encounter the dragon and to vanquish this black host. Timothy Dwight, president of Yale College, informed the class of 1776 that it was the United States' destiny to be Emmanuel's land, the principal seat of that particular kingdom which shall be given to the saints of the Most High. Samuel West of New Hampshire expounded upon the Old Testament prophecies and the book of Revelation in predicting that a new and remarkable era had begun. George Duffield of Philadelphia proclaimed that, quote, America seems to have been prepared as the wilderness to which the woman should fly from the face of the dragon, end quote. And it was the United States' destiny to go into the West and bring the unenlightened tribes of this wilderness to know and adore our Emmanuel. Those who worried about the possibility of a French alliance, that the United States had turned to Satan to fight Satan, were reassured by Sherwood that France, a Catholic monarchy with every reason not to support a Republican colonial rebellion against a sibling monarchy, even if Protestant, may be redeemed by contact with the United States. He made it possible for Protestants to begin to accept the dangerous irony of taking the hand of an old enemy to humble the former mother country. The American alliance with the French was made possible through an unexpected victory in the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. Grateful Americans perceived yet again the divine hand of God and assigned to him credit for the victory. David Avery of Massachusetts summarized the course of the war to that date, noting the many times that the Americans either miraculously achieved victory or were providentially rescued from fatal defeats. Nonetheless, Americans continued to prove themselves ungrateful wretches, little deserving of God's favor, wallowing in their sins and impiety, and thus inviting imminent divine judgment. Unless they rectified their immoral ways, he warned, the glorious cause could easily be lost. A common refrain, standard in sermons to soldiers. Interestingly, in a footnote, Avery tops the list of American sins with the enslavement of Africans. Doth not this sin cry to heaven for retaliation, he asks. Abraham Cateltus of Massachusetts reminded his auditors at Newburyport that the War of Independence is, in short, the cause of the Reformation against popery, and in short, it is the cause of heaven against hell. New England's patriots might have been willing to accept French money and shipments and materiel to supply the Continental Army, but they did not greet the presence of French soldiers and sailors on American soil with unqualified enthusiasm. John and Samuel Adams had both argued since the start of the war that the United States should stand alone without relying on foreign aid, but both recognized that pragmatism necessitated soliciting a military alliance with France and later with Spain. Nonetheless, Protestant Americans from New Hampshire to Georgia wondered if the Continental Congress had not just made a fatal deal with the devil. As welcome as new shipments of French arms, the deployment of 10,000 soldiers, and the participation of its Navy might have been to the war effort, they still constituted a potential threat to American independence and culture with their perceived addictions to absolutism and idolatrous ceremony. Loyalist polemics tried to make as much hay as possible over the French alliance. Anglican parsons stood at the front lines of this war of words, highlighting the contradiction between Calvinist New England revolutionaries accusing the Church of England of reverting to Catholicism while celebrating an alliance with the Catholic power. This indicated that the Continental Congress was willing to sacrifice American Protestantism for the sake of independence, which in the end would be abrogated by French dominion. An article in the Pennsylvania Ledger accused the revolutionaries of, quote, strengthening the most powerful enemies of the Reformation towards the universal re-establishment of popery throughout all Christendom, end quote. And Charles Inglis of New York ruefully predicted the imminent importation, quote, of popish priests, beads, and other such trumpery into the colonies, end quote. Simultaneously celebrating the recent victory at Saratoga and commemorating the foundation of the Plymouth colony in 1620, Samuel West offered an exegesis of Isaiah 66:5-9 that interpreted the newly formed states in America as the children of Zion. The surrender of Burgoyne's army in 1777 signaled God's favor upon the United States, the establishment of which fulfills the Old Testament prophecy that Zion's children will usher in an era of true religion in preparation for Christ. Though careful not to proclaim that Isaiah had explicitly been witnessing the birth of the United States through prescient eyes, West remained fully persuaded that we may see how surprisingly the several parts of our text have been accomplished and even literally fulfilled in the dispensations of divine providence, both towards our fathers and towards us, their posterity, in the present day. Either way, the independence of the United States, if not actually predicted by Isaiah, nonetheless for West, represented a necessary prerequisite to the ultimate revival of pure Christianity, being the dissident Protestant variety, that Revelation 19 places as the onset of the millennium. Then the sun disappeared from New England. Staring up into the inky blackness that momentous day, Samuel Gatchell of Marblehead, Massachusetts, connected the dark day to the stunted progress of the Revolutionary War that year. General Washington was having incessant difficulty keeping the Continental Army together. Officers were defecting to the British and threatening mutiny, Benedict Arnold being only the most prominent. British General Clinton believed it only a matter of time before the Americans would be forced to sue for peace in the face of the Revolution's imminent collapse. In The Signs of the Times, Gatchell took the war and the dark day as indicators of the oncoming apocalypse, citing the prophet Joel's prediction that a day of darkness would enshroud Zion in the latter days. But a greater darkness hung over patriot minds by 1780, and that was a pending financial collapse. Congress borrowed huge sums and paid for war material and supplies with highly inflated paper currency, drowning the infant United States in an ocean of red ink. The exploitation of the drastically weakened economies of the rebelling states by profiteers constituted a serious problem for the revolutionaries, who had been extolling the Spartan virtues of Republican American society. Loyalists had long argued that the merchant leaders of the revolution were merely a cabal, or a network of cabals, organized to enrich themselves at the expense of the majority of colonists who depended upon them for the necessities of living. Patriots countered by portraying loyalist elites as sunk in the same corruption that had eaten away the British Constitution. So wary had Americans become about taxation that the Articles of Confederation left it up to the individual states, which were themselves deeply reluctant to levy any new taxes. When forced by necessity to impose higher taxes to maintain their economies and finance their share of the war effort, the states faced vociferous complaints, evasion, and sporadic riots, identical to what had vexed British policymakers in the 1760s. Patriotic appeals from Congress and the assemblies to the populace to live up to their fiscal responsibilities often fell on stubbornly covered ears, and clergymen increasingly carried the burden of shaming their congregations into contributing to the general welfare. Herman Husband, a Pennsylvania state assemblyman, urged heightened vigilance against corruption, idleness, and luxury in a pamphlet anonymously published in 1782, which outlined a reformation of the U.S. government heavily borrowed from passages of the books of Ezekiel, Daniel, the Gospels, and Revelation. He pointed out that the Israelites in the Old Testament maintained their society through voluntary tithing, and the New Testament deplored Roman taxation and its system of collection as a sin. The colonists rebelled against direct taxation, and Husband noted that Congress's tax schemes were being evaded and resisted, thus encouraging the vice of avoiding one's civic duties. Government should subsist on the voluntary payment of a proportional share of one's profits or surplus, with the rest coming out of what amounts to a national sales tax. This would ultimately lead to a genuinely egalitarian society envisioned by Ezekiel and Daniel, husband predicted, and only when the U.S. government implemented his or some similar scheme would the biblical prophecies be fulfilled. Isaac Backus and Elisha Rich of Massachusetts and John Leland of Virginia, all Baptists, targeted religious establishments in New England and in the South as synonymous with the despised and satanic papacy, which in their turn must fall before Christ's millennial reign. Rich employed quote-unquote spiritual arithmetic, essentially numerology, to identify the beast as not merely Roman Catholic theocracy, but Protestant establishmentarianism as well. And here, thousands of souls are miserably deceived and led away with the beast, and none can persuade them this is their case, and yet these persons will manifest the greatest detestation against such a dress as the beast may wear in Rome, and yet be admired. And therefore those souls are much deceived that think that they are not of the beast's kingdom because they have a good outward or fleshly reformation, or in other words, a good outward form of godliness. All in all, these and other exegetes believe that only through a total reformation of American society, through a national refrain from and repentance of a smorgasbord of sins, could the true promise of the United States be accomplished. One of those sins was that of slavery. The rhetoric of personal liberty in the Declaration of Independence gave enslaved blacks hope that there would be general emancipation in the event of American victory and independence. Slaves sometimes served as substitutes for their masters, while others ran away to join the Continental Army and state militias. Most found themselves working as teamsters or support personnel rather than joining combat units as soldiers, though those who did fight in the ranks did so in a fully integrated army. Revolutionary leaders, particularly those from the South, proved extremely reluctant to arm blacks and train them in military tactics for fear that such skills would prove useful in slave insurrections. Although slave resistance had been an issue with which white slave owners struggled ever since the first Africans landed in Virginia in 1619, evangelical Protestantism brought into the slave communities of the South an ideological locus around which slave insurrectionists could plot rebellion against white domination. For this and other reasons, George Washington initially refused to allow states to enlist as soldiers in the Continental Army and wished to limit allow slaves to enlist as soldiers in the Continental Army and wished to limit the participation of free blacks. Although slaves found inspiration for their dreams of liberation primarily in the book of Exodus, they also saw it in the prophetic text of the Old Testament, perceiving themselves as spiritually akin to the Hebrews languishing in Egypt or to the Israelites lost in Babylonian captivity. That African Americans, especially slaves, viewed the Revolutionary War as an apocalyptic struggle for their liberation is hardly surprising, given that the vast majority of slaves and freedmen who served on either side of the conflict came from among the ranks of Baptists and Methodists who engaged in the most systematic campaign of proselytization of African Americans during and after the First Great Awakening. New Lights, in general, espoused a millenarian theology interpreting America as the new canon and the colonists as God's chosen people. Likewise, those who cast their lot with the British believed the war to be won fought at least partly for their freedom. Either way, the result would be the destruction of the old world and the birth of a new one in keeping with apocalyptic belief. For those slaves who joined the British lines, service meant not just their personal freedom, but the promise of full-scale emancipation. King George III, who had become a virtual antichrist in patriot propaganda, became to slaves a benevolent liberator. A few patriot writers distinguished themselves by tackling the thorny issue of slavery as a national sin, rather than as a merely regrettable vice, and one that must be expiated in order for the United States to win the war and fulfill the millennial prophecies. Samuel Hopkins of Newport, Rhode Island, compared the institution to the beast of Revelation. The present calamities under which the rebelling colonies suffered came in part because of slavery, he averred. And unless there is a general manumission, quote, slavery and destruction, like that which came upon the obstinate, unreformed Jews, end quote, will snuff out the sputtering flame of American independence. The energy of millenarian expectation for African Americans left unfulfilled by the Revolution fed into a full-scale theology of liberation that so infused African American Christianity as to give it its essential characteristics throughout the antebellum period and beyond. Yeoman farmers of the frontier Piedmont, the artisans and mechanics of the cities and towns, and the slave laborers alike all found in apocalyptic rhetoric and imagery a common identity they believed that they shared with the utility in firing resistance to British authority, but it was not taken lightly or irresponsibly propagated. Americans of all sorts, whether patriot or loyalist, subscribed in some degree to belief in American religious exceptionalism. Connecticut's Governor Jonathan Trumbull, in a letter to Silas Deane written in 1778, gave vent to enthusiastic panegyrics on the Revolution as the first signs of Armageddon. Quote, "We are in the latter end of the last days," end quote, witnessing the foundation of an, quote, "empire in this Western world to enlarge our Redeemer's kingdom and to pull down the papacy," end quote. John Adams, in a 1780 letter to General Nathanael Greene, who at the time was serving as Quartermaster General, proclaimed the United States to be the fulfillment of New England founder John Winthrop's 17th century millenarian hope that the New World would be the salvation of the entire world. "America is the city set upon a hill," Adams wrote. Private Elisha Stevens, after the American defeat at the Battle of Brandywine Creek in September 1777, recalled the, quote, "men a-dying, the wounded's horrid groans which would grieve the hardest of hearts to see such a doleful sight as this, to see our fellow creatures slain in such a manner as this." At such moments, Private Stevens and his comrades did not take comfort in the abstract philosophical ruminations of Algernon Sidney, John Locke, the Baron de Montesquieu, or Sir William Blackstone. The words of the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the American Crisis have their power to inspire, but it was religion that confirmed for the patriots that the one true God stood with them. The war for independence appeared to be another installment, and perhaps a final one, in the long battle of good against evil, and Americans of all political persuasions subscribed to some measure of belief in that. Upon learning of the British surrender at Yorktown, John Adams could not restrain himself from expressing a millenarian euphoria in a letter to his wife Abigail, when he predicted that the great designs of Providence must be accomplished. Great indeed, the progress of society will be accelerated by centuries by this revolution. That John Adams or Jonathan Trumbull would use such religiously enthusiastic language in private highlights the revolution's religious and millenarian facets. They shared with the population at large an ingrained Protestant eschatological mentality, and apocalyptic and millenarian interpretations of the revolution offered a powerful rhetorical tool for creating a nationalist mindset necessary for the waging of a war and the establishment of a democratic republic. Ezra Stiles, in his 1783 sermon to Governor Trumbull and the Connecticut General Assembly, believed he was witnessing the promised day of the Lord with the establishment of a nation built upon a double foundation of republicanism and Protestant Christianity. Surveying the historical development of political systems, Stiles concluded that only dissenting Protestantism could have made the United States of America possible, and that the land was singularly blessed with wealth of natural resources and human talent bound inevitably to produce a powerful nation destined to lead the world. This American Israel, he predicted, will one day become a great power destined to spread its divine light to the entire world. There's Mr. Stiles, and here's what he wrote. This great American Revolution will be attended to and contemplated by all nations. The prophecy of Daniel is now literally fulfilling. There shall be a universal traveling to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. This knowledge will be brought home and treasured up in America, and being here digested and carried to the highest perfection, may reblaze back from America to Europe, Asia, and Africa, and illumine the world with truth and liberty. Stiles' sermon serves as a capstone to colonial American millenarian expectations revived during the First Great Awakening and reaching a peak of fulfillment through the independence of the United States of America. The end. All right, so questions, comments, tomatoes and brick bats. I nailed it so well. I can't believe that. Go ahead.
Well, I used to live in upstate New York in an area that was very heavy Tory. And the Embry, the gentleman who started the Second Methodist Church in the United States, immigrated to the area, started the church. Fortunately for him, he died 2 years before the war. Unfortunately, his family was very pro-Tory to the point where they are listed in the volumes of those who fled to Canada and were remunerated at a amount that's staggeringly small.
Oh, sure, yeah.
For their losses.
All those petitions for remuneration, because.
Yeah, if you've read the volume, that there's a copy, I know the Garland Library, which is where I'm from, has a copy. But it's interesting to read the remunerations and the numbers that were rejected and the causes for them, and yet you see their losses were just staggering. And yet the worst scoundrel of the whole lot, a guy named Philip Steen, he gets the most out of it. He's the one who caused Burgoyne, among other major contributor to Burgoyne's defeat. I find it very amusing to, he convinced Burgoyne to run a road from Whitehall, down Whitehall, to the Hudson. And there was already a road there, but he convinced him it was a better road, which opened up his property.
Yeah.
And tied up the British Army and all that sort of thing. So I find it very interesting that, like in the case of the Methodist Church, like I said, fortunately, Embry died, allowing the Methodist Church to continue, because had he lived, he would have supported the revolution and had major negative impact on the Methodist Church expansion here in the United States.
Yeah, the Methodists had the poor luck of that timing, right? They showed up and they were just seen as kind of this weird offshoot of Anglicanism, and just assumed, oh, you're still Anglican, so
Yeah.
you're the king's people, right? Same thing happened to the Shakers, because the Van League and her contingent showed up in upstate New York
Right.
in 1774, and because of their Britishness were assumed to be because their accents was all that. And then they said, well, our job is not to be involved in these things. You guys, no, Patriots aren't going to have that. It's a with us or against us kind of mentality that they have. Yeah.
The very first paper that you put a picture of up there was, it started with an E, I think, Enoch or something like that. What is that paper?
Oh, you mean Cato's letters?
I'm sorry.
Was that Cato's letters? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that Cato, yeah.
Yeah.
What is that?
Those were, there was a newspaper that was printed by a couple of English radicals in the 1720s, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, and it was called the Independent Whig. And they used it as a platform to write.
Okay, I'd heard of the Independent Whig, and I did not.
Yeah, they
know
were
what
extremely
it was.
critical of the government, and they accused the ministers of corruption and money grubbing and all of that stuff. And then when Parliament started passing all these new taxes, in the 1760s and 70s, newspapers started printing, colonial newspapers started reprinting selected Cato's letters to, certain newspapers did. Others obviously didn't, but they ginned up indignation, saying, oh, this Stamp Act and this other thing, they're not designed to relieve anything to do with the British debt. This is money that's going to go directly into the wrong pockets. And it's funny, it's amazing how timely things stay. Corruption, we're always complaining about corruption, we're always worried about that. They tax us and we wonder where the money goes, and is the money going to the right places and all that stuff. And
So did you follow that particular newspaper or paper or whatever? I don't know how often it printed or how long, but did you follow it throughout all of that research?
I haven't read all of Cato's letters, but I have read issues of the. I'd rather go to the Independent Whig. You can do that online, and I've read many issues of those, and they bring up religious, themes too.
Okay.
Because the whole point of my of my book, that this is basically a chapter in my forthcoming book about millennialism in America up to 1890.
So you do expand from this?
Yeah. So I mean, when I was a PhD student, I read a book by John Butler called Washington State of Faith, and in his chapter on the American Revolution, he said that religion had virtually nothing to do with the revolution. He said the revolution was a profoundly secular event. And I tell my students about this all the time. I wrote bullshit in the margin. Because I thought, no, I mean, people back then, even if they weren't overtly religious or highly devout, still understood the world more in Christian terms than we tend to today.
Yeah.
And so I looked and just saw all this stuff. It's like, maybe, I was talking about George Washington, for instance. He wanted chaplains in the army, but he just wanted them to keep the soldiers in line. He wasn't worried about their souls. And there's a great story about George Washington after the war. When he went back home and retired, he would go to church every Sunday, but then when it came time to do the communion, he and Martha would get up and leave before the communion. And his parson pulled him aside one day, and said, "Hey, General, that doesn't look good. You're a pillar of the community. You need to show a good example and not walk out before the bread and the wine." And Washington's response was to stop going to church. To avoid being a poor, he'd rather just set that example than be a poor example by getting up, So.
Well, thank you for helping me think this through.
Oh, sure. But yeah, I saw a lot of historians who kind of went along with that and said, yeah, religion didn't have much to do with it. It's like, well, yeah, maybe George Washington was cynical about it. Maybe others were sort of using the language, but that just means they recognize that ordinary people would respond to that. And believe some of this stuff, right? And so that's why I end up thinking about the guy talking about, which leads to that famous dictum, no atheists in foxholes. That's that kind of thing. It's like, yeah, if you're going to face British bayonets, you don't tend to do it with the words of John Locke ringing in your ears. Natural rights, but if you think okay, I might die, but if I die, I'm going to get a really good spot in God's great destination resort. Yeah, I'll do it for that, but for fight for abstract philosophical principles, it's hard to get people motivated by that sort of thing. Religion is much better. So yeah, I'm just sort of countering this kind of, and a lot of historians have kind of come along too, and I'm sort of, I guess I'm part of that wave that says, well, religion and politics are more of an even mixture.
Awesome.
All right,
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. Let's see. Next month's speaker is going to be Dr. Rudin, actually, president of the Texas A&M University over in Commerce. So we haven't actually had him speak out here yet. So this will be his first time.
He was supposed to speak the month
Earlier, yeah. And so thank you all for coming and have a great day.